Good afternoon to all. I, Virat Rawal, on behalf of Applied Mechanics Department, LD College of Engineering, Ahmedabad, and Government Engineering College, Modhasa, welcomes you once again on Day 1, Session 2 of this short-term training program on Disaster Management and Resilience Building, conducted under aegis of Directorate of Technical Education and in collaboration with GIDM. I am pretty sure that all of you have enjoyed the first session wholeheartedly. So just to increase the knowledge of the joy of knowledge, we are bringing the another eminent personality, Dr. Repual Kanji sir. Sir is currently working as a research scientist and program manager at Gujarat Institute of Disaster Management, India. Sir holds a BTech degree in computer science from NIT Calicut and has a master's and a PhD degree in disaster mitigation and management from IIT Roorkee. Sir is associated as a young scientist with the Integrated Research on Disaster Risk, which is a transdisciplinary research platform of the International Science Council and the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. Sir has also the additional charge of Research Officer at SAARC, Disaster Management Center, Government of India. Sir has more than 7 years of experience and various publications, including the contributions in UNDRR's flagship Global Assessment Report of 2022. Sir is one of the few Indian cultural first aiders trained to aid cultural heritage in times of crisis by UNESCO's Capacity Building Wing, ICC Rome. And I am extremely happy to share that Sir is also the first winner of the first edition of India 24H Entrepreneurship Challenge. Sir is a social entrepreneur involved in the Risk and Resilience Institute and founding member of the National Platform of Youth and Young Professionals of India, working in disaster risk management and climate action, part of U-Inspire Alliance, a global movement across the globe, supported by UNDRR and UNESCO. Sir, we are really grateful to have you on the board for hearing the words of knowledge and wisdom regarding disaster risk management, local and global perspective. From your dictionary of knowledge and experience, which you have earned in your vast career, it is my honor to welcome you on behalf of the Applied Mechanics Department of both the colleges. Over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, Virat. Thank you for that humble introduction and also reminding me of things that I have somehow done, but I do not remember right now. Thank you so much for that. Okay, so shall we start the presentation or should we wait for some more people to join?
So you are not audible?
Is this okay? Am I audible now?
Yes,
No?
sir, yes, yes,
Okay.
yes.
Thank you for the introduction. And should we start the presentation or should we wait for some other participants to join?
Sir, we may start. Sir,
Okay.
we may start.
Great. Perfect. So let me just share the presentation. I hope my screen is visible to everyone.
Yes, sir, it's perfectly visible.
Perfect. Great. Wonderful. So yes. So welcome everyone who has been able to join us virtually. And this session spanning over a little more than 1 hour, where we'll be discussing about, of course, disaster risk management. But I will be focusing on the local and global perspectives of what disaster risk management is. And more importantly, what I feel is that I should actually warn all of you, because what I would be talking about might sound repetitive to a certain extent, because I had the chance of listening into what Professor Surya Prakash was sharing this morning. And you see, it might have an essence of repetition to some extent. But then again, I have tried my best to compile the entire thing in a way which would probably be a challenge to all of you. So what we will do is that we will run through the presentation, and I give you the privilege of stopping me anywhere you want to and ask any questions, or if you want to add any comment to whatever I'm saying, because maybe after 1 hour you might not be so much, interested in engaging in a conversation, which is very, very important. So at any point of time you feel that you want to say something, please do so, right? So let's move forward. The presentation that I have today is ideally about challenging your beliefs that you have, challenging the understandings that you already have about disaster management. So throughout the presentation, what I will be doing is I will be making certain important statements, and I would try to justify those statements to the best of my ability, right? Uh, Anywhere you feel that you can challenge me, you are free to do so. So the very first question, or rather a question that would be better, is that to ask all of those who are present, you can answer using your mic, or even using the chat box which is available. So what we see in front of the screen is probably an earthquake, a flood, a tsunami, an extreme heat event. Now, are these disasters? That's the first question that I have for all of you. So if any one of you want to answer it, it would be really great. At least, to break the monotony of me speaking to you, which is not very interesting.
Most of these are man-made.
Okay, interesting. Anyone else? Okay, let's move on, and then I will hope that this session would become more engaging. So this is the first statement that I intend to make in front of all of you. Generally, what we understand is that disasters are events which leads to death, which leads to life loss, which leads to economic loss, right? And we tend to understand disasters as events. But I say that disasters are not events, but they are processes, right? So this is the first statement that I'm trying to make. And this is the second statement that I'm trying to make. Disasters are, again, of course, not events, but they are consequences. So there are two important things that I just mentioned. Our understanding of disaster is that it is an event, which leads to deaths, which leads to losses, which leads to damages, right? So we see it, or we understand it as events. But what I'm trying to say here is that they are not events, they are consequences of a process, right? Now, to understand this, we will take two very different paths. The first path is of understanding the definition of a disaster. I have already warned you that this might sound a little bit of repetitive, but this is very, very important. We use the term disaster, we refer to the word disaster very, very casually. In our day-to-day life, whatever happens, we generally call back home or our friends and say, "Arey yaar, disaster ho gaya mere saath." We do that. But it's very interesting to note that disasters have a legal connotation, right? So this is the definition of a disaster, which has been prescribed by the National Disaster Management Act of 2005. I'm not asking you to mug this definition. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to explain that throughout this entire definition, the understanding of disasters as an event is not there. It is a catastrophe, it is a mishap, calamity, or grave occurrence, right? Which can be due to natural or man-made causes, which results in substantial loss of life or human suffering beyond the coping capacity of the community of the affected area. So in this entire definition, if you delve in, if you deep dive, you will understand that the the interpretation is not just an event, it's an occurrence, right? And for something to occur, we need a process to happen behind it. I'm sure most of us joining here are engineers, maybe. I'm guessing I might be wrong, but even then, not only technical engineers or technological engineers, but also social engineers. So an occurrence requires a process to work in the background, right? So this is the interpretation, the definition, the legal connotation of disasters as per the Act. Let me give you another definition. This is the definition of disasters given by the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. So basically, this is the highest advocating body of the world under the aegis of the United Nations Organization, which works on disaster risk management, advocacy, and capacity building and whatnot. So they are defining disasters as a serious disruption of the functioning of a community, right? Any scale due to hazardous events, right? So they are saying that the occurrence or the consequence is due to a hazardous event, but the consequence itself is not an event, right? And they again bring up very important words that we need to understand, probably we need to understand: exposure, vulnerability, and capacity, leading to one or more of the following: human, material, economic losses, and impacts. So there is a lot of similarity between these two definitions. Both of these definitions inherently tries to communicate the idea that disasters are the occurrences or the consequences which happens due to a process which runs in the background, which probably we are not aware of. And this process is driven by 3 or 4 variables or elements or parameters, whichever word you think would justify the essence of it. So what are those variables? A hazardous event, which is interacting with the exposure, vulnerability, and capacity. So this gives a very clear understanding that our contemporary knowledge of referring to disasters as events is very, very wrong. We could have understood that if we had if we had gone deeper into this definition, but perhaps we did not. And interestingly enough, if you want another example, you should probably look up the definition of a disaster as per the Gujarat State Disaster Management Act of 2003. You would find similarities with these two definitions. So the first thing that we probably discussed about is that disasters are not really events. They are consequences. They are the occurrences behind which there is a process that we need to look into. And those processes are driven by certain parameters or variables, which are probably hazardous events, exposure, vulnerability, and capacity. That eventually leads to human loss, material loss, economic loss, and impacts. Right. So this is the first way of looking at that disasters are not basically events. Now, to understand this through another approach, what I would do is that I would give you a fact. If you look up in Google, you would probably come across many researches, studies, and statements which summarize the idea that earthquakes do not kill people, but buildings do. And you would come across several such articles, several such proofs per se, that would give you a good amount of idea that really it's not basically the earthquakes that lead to the death of people, it's due to the buildings. Now let me break this down for you. Let's imagine an earthquake hits a particular place, a town, or an area. So what happens is that the buildings in those areas, they are damaged. Some of them collapses because they are not strong enough in a way, and that leads to death and injuries. Now, the first thing one tells you that what to do during an earthquake is always to move out of the building, right? Reach an assembly point, reach a safe area with no building surrounding to you. So these are the things that we do. So basically the idea is that if you are inside a building during an earthquake and the building is not strong enough, it would probably be damaged or it would collapse due to its own weight, and that would lead to deaths and injuries, right? So I do not believe that there is any confusion in this understanding. If you have, please do stop me and make your point. There's no problem in that. Now let us expand this idea to another event, let's say cyclone. I'm guessing a good portion of the participants today comes from Gujarat, I'm assuming again. But now, because of the increasing frequency of the occurrences of cyclone, probably almost all of us are aware of how our coastal areas are affected by cyclones and all that. So let's imagine this situation. So there is a cyclone hitting an area and a coastal town rather, and the buildings in those coastal towns will get damaged if there is a cyclone, which is understood. The infrastructure would get damaged, which is also understood. It can also be affected and not damaged per se, but yes, something would happen. And then livelihoods are also lost. Livelihoods, as in imagine fields getting destroyed. So all the people who are dependent on those fields for livelihood, that gets damaged, and then there's a whole lot of process that goes behind it as to how do you ensure that the livelihoods are built back. So this happens, and then the effect and impact can be seen in terms of injuries, deaths, economic loss, environmental loss. Now, due to the advancement that different state governments have made, the Indian government has made, the number of deaths have gone down substantially. If you want to, reinsure yourself, then you should check the statistics of deaths that happened in the 99 super cyclone, compare it with any other cyclone in Odisha that has taken place in the recent years. So you would see a substantial decrease in the number of deaths. Also in the number of injuries, but still there are certain injuries. Economic losses, yes, there are still economic losses, and to a certain extent we do also experience environmental losses. So this is what happens in case of a cyclone. So there seems to be a very interesting pattern, right? In the last example, what we saw is that an earthquake hitting a town or an area and the buildings getting affected by it, damaged, and some collapses, which is leading to some effect and impact. And in case of also a cyclone, the same things are happening, right? The more things or the more number of assets that are present in the coastal town, in this case, will get affected, right? So there seems to be a pattern. So something bad is happening and it is affecting a town, and depending on that, there are evident effects and impacts. Now, let me give you an anti-pattern to that. Let's imagine the same thing, a cyclone, but this time it is affecting or hitting a ghost town. What I mean by a ghost town is that there are no people living in that. There are no villages per se. There is no building. There are no infrastructures, and since there are no people, so there are no livelihoods. So the cyclone comes and it passes over. It makes a landfall and it passes over the ghost town, and there are no effects and no impacts. Maybe no injuries at all because there are no people present there. There's no habitation there, no deaths, of course. Economic losses also no. Maybe a little bit of environmental loss if we are considering that there are certain elements of the environment which we do care about. So in that case, we probably would see some effects and impacts. So do you see that there is a very good methodology that is reappearing, right? There is this hazardous event like a cyclone or an earthquake which affects something, and then there are effects and impacts to it, right? So this is what it boils down to. Something bad like an earthquake or a cyclone or an extreme heat is hitting us, hitting you, hitting me, our family, our home, our lives. And then the question is that do we have the capacity to kind of deal with it or manage it, manage the consequences? Well, if we do have the capacity, good enough. And if we don't, then of course there's something bad that can happen, right? So this is a very generic understanding, which we have derived with the pattern and the anti-pattern. Now let us put terminologies to it. These are key terminologies that we are supposed to understand when we are dealing with disaster management or disaster risk management. So these bad things which were affecting us, hitting us, earthquake, cyclone, extreme heat, epidemic, avalanche, tsunami, landslide, these are hazards. Now, these hazards essentially need to interact with people, with infrastructure, with our habitat, with our livelihood and economy. And depending upon how strong or how capable these exposed assets are, the vulnerabilities would be understood, right? For example, just to break it down a little bit more, in case of an earthquake, what happens is that the hazard is an earthquake, which hits our infrastructure, let's say a school building, right? Now, if the school building is not strong enough to withstand the shaking of the ground, we can, of course, imagine the building to crumble down, right? So the building not being strong enough is the physical vulnerability of that building. Now let's imagine another situation where the earthquake hits the school building and the building is not strong enough. So it's structurally vulnerable. But what happens is that the students or the teachers in the school, they are well trained, right? They have been practicing of what to do during an earthquake. They are well aware of that. They are well trained. They have been doing drills. So they feel the earth shaking and they quickly rush out, and there is a demarcated assembly point. They go there. So this is not their vulnerability. This is their capacity. This knowledge, this awareness is their capacity. So although the building is physically vulnerable, but there is very, very less social vulnerability because the people are aware of what to do, exactly what to do. Now imagine the same situation, but add another layer of information to it. So the building is damaged. The people are safe, the students, the teachers, they are very, very safe, no problem. But now the question is that the earthquake is now over and people need to go back to their studies once again, right? So the building has to come up and it will obviously take time. Now, during this time when the building is coming up, you cannot leave the students hanging, right? They need to continue the studies. How do you do it? Maybe arrange for an alternative, maybe ensure online teaching, right? So there are different avenues of doing it, but all of this would require what? Investment, right? Now imagine this happens in a city where it has no funds. It's rarest of the rare occurrences if you think of India and the structure of India, but this can very well be the case in a nation in Africa or in a small island developing state. It can very well be the scenario where the physical vulnerability is there, but social vulnerability is not there. People are well trained, well aware, but then the question of rebuilding or the question of continuity remains a big question because there are no economic avenues to support it. So that becomes an economic vulnerability. So you need to understand that there are multiple layers to this entire thing. So it's not just the hazard affecting a city or a town. You have to be very, very critical about what it is affecting. The people or the infrastructure or the habitat or the livelihood and economy. And all those things which are being affected, how vulnerable it is or how capable it is to withstand that shock or stress posed by the hazard, right? So this is one part of the breakdown. So what happens is if this process is being followed, so the hazard interacts with the exposed assets. Actually, it interacts with the vulnerabilities of the exposed assets, and there is a condition of emergency. Right? Now, this emergency needs to be dealt with. If we have the capacity to deal with this, then there is a probability that we will bounce back to normalcy. If we don't have the capacity, then it becomes a disaster. We need to understand this. It is not just the earthquake hitting us or the cyclone hitting us is a disaster. No, the cyclone has to interact with the vulnerabilities of the exposed assets, and the exposed assets can be people, can be infrastructure, can be building, can be economy, can be livelihood, can be anything. And it generates a condition of emergency which requires immediate attention. That immediate attention can be in terms of SDRF and NDRF forces being dispatched. That can be the case. It can be a case of emergency where the fire brigades have to be dispatched. It can be a case where just the people of the community are capable enough to respond to it. So if they are capable of responding to it, there is a chance that there will be some minimal amount of losses, which is probably acceptable to us, maybe. But if they are not capable enough, it leads to a disaster. So this is the entire process that is followed. Hazards, as someone mentioned earlier, it is man-made and it is natural. So these hazards, they can be natural, they can be anthropogenic. Anthropogenic as in human-made. We have stopped using the term man-made because it is not very gender sensitive, it is not gender neutral. And if anyone wants, you can note it down and ask me later why it is being done. So hazards, basically, they can be natural, they can be human induced, they can be anthropogenic, and they essentially need to interact with the vulnerabilities of the exposed assets. There can be physical vulnerabilities, there can be social vulnerabilities, there can be economic vulnerabilities, there can be attitudinal vulnerabilities as well, right? And then we have capacities. Now, while talking about disaster management, generally what happens that when we talk about capacities, we generally refer to resources, right? As in how many boats we have, how many JCBs we do have, but this capacities do not get limited to that understanding. This capacity can be a mere knowledge of doing something good, right? So depending upon all these four factors, hazard, exposure, vulnerability, capacity, what happens is there is a scenario of emergency which needs immediate attention, immediate response. So if we respond, then there's a chance that it will probably go back to normal, right? And there can be another situation where we respond, but we are not able to manage the entire consequence. That can also happen because you can always prepare up to a certain level only. And the magnitude and the intensity of the entire thing can go beyond whatever you have prepared for. So there will be certain amount of acceptable loss. But when all these categories are going away, all these stages are going away, and we are left with nothing to do, that is when a disaster happens. So this is the entire process of how an event is the hazard, becomes a disaster. So this is the process that I was referring to. Now, hazards, they can be slow onset ones. For example, drought, right? If you are from India or if you are from certain regions of MP, Maharashtra, you would know how big a problem it is. So in those cases, the hazards can be slow onset. There are hazards like rapid onset ones, for example, earthquake. But this entire thing of exposure, vulnerability, and capacity, this is a slow onset process, right? Exposure in terms of imagine what did we consider in case of an exposure? A city, buildings, infrastructure. A building or an infrastructure does not come up in a day. It is not a rapid thing to happen. So buildings, people, civilization, habitation, planning, this happens over a long period of time. When we are doing this, if we are not accounting for our so-called effects and impacts of hazard, then our vulnerabilities are creeping in, our capacities are being lowered. So that also happens over a period of time, not in a day, not in a month, not in a year. It happens over a period of time. And when such an event actually manifests itself and our capacities are overwhelmed, that is when it gives rise to an emergency-like situation. In India, it is preferable to use the term emergency. If you go to European Union, probably it will be a crisis. So you respond to an emergency or a crisis. Either you emerge almost okay if you are capable enough to manage everything, that's bouncing back to normalcy. If you're not, then there will possibly be some acceptable losses. And if both these stages are not met, what happens essentially is that you land up in a disaster. So this is the entire thing that happens behind an event getting converted into a disaster. And just to give you another example, which would probably explain this in a very familial way, in a way that you would probably relate to more. You see this group of buildings in front of you. If you are from Ahmedabad or Gandhinagar in Gujarat, or for that matter any part of India as well, you would have seen these typology of buildings, right? Probably as a normal person, you would not be able to make out what problems there are. But as a disaster risk management professional, the first thing that I noticed is that these buildings are on stilts, right? That is, the ground floor is in a way not complete like the other floors, right? So what happens is that whenever it is hit by an earthquake, the building is supposed to sway in this manner, right? So probably a normal person would not know this, that is understandable. But imagine that hundreds of families are living in this kind of buildings, and they are completely unaware of how structurally vulnerable this building will be if it is hit by an earthquake, right? So they are unaware of that, first of all. The second most important thing is that if by chance this happens, no one has ever really given it a thought that what we should do as a family or as an individual member, what to do in case of an earthquake. They do not know because they have not considered this instance ever. We leave for office early in the morning, 10:30, and then go back, then have a cup of tea with pakoda and sitting without even thinking that the building that we are staying in, living in, is so vulnerable to an earthquake. We have never imagined it. We have never imagined what we should do if that is the case. So this vulnerability, this ignorance, this unawareness of us is building over a period of time. But when one day, God forbid, an earthquake hits us, we would see the prima facie consequence in front of us. We would see the buildings that have fallen down. We would see people who are affected, injured, maybe dead also. And that becomes important to us. But imagine this, or think about this, that what has led to this entire process of we being ignorant about it, right? So the next question that probably would come to your mind is that how, as a normal person, are you asking all of us to be aware of this thing? Now, this is something that Professor Surya Prakash also mentioned in his session. He was talking about the vulnerability atlas, which are developed by BMTPC. The problem is that these kind of atlases, maps, rather information is available to all of us. It's available to all of us to the extent that they are freely available. The only thing that is stopping us from knowing it is our urge to know. It put very simply, right? We have time to like different pages on Facebook. We have time to forward messages on WhatsApp and Telegram, but we do not have time or the intention or the urge to think about the place where we stay in. Is it prone to earthquakes? If some of you are curious enough, it is very good. You should be. And if not, then you should be curious about knowing how safe you are in a place where you stay. Now, my point is that we have these kind of information maps, atlases that available to us, right? Now, depending on these seismic zonations that you see in front of you, there are building codes that has been designed, devised, and they are implemented. Depending upon these kind of building codes, development control regulations are also written down and passed and legalized. And it is within these kind of regulations you get mention of what kind of standards to follow for what kind of safety. For structural safety, you have to follow these kind of standards. For seismic safety, you have to follow this kind of standards. Even this is relevant in case of fire. So there are different safety standards for fire as well, right? So a lot of information is available to us, and it is not that things are not being done, but then we all know what the general problem is, what is actually ensuring that even after all this knowledge, all this information, all of this implications, there we are facing events like big disasters. So we need to understand that there are a lot of things that are available, but yet somehow we are failing to kind of prevent those disasters, right? So what I would do is that give you a very quick example of how I think that these kind of disasters, with the information that we already have, we can prevent those kind of disasters. So this is a work that I happen to be a part of in one of my assignments. So there is this town in Paris which is called Marseille, and it had problems of flooding, right? So as any other area or city in India, which we are witnessing right now, it also had problems of flooding. So what was done basically? So using technology, using engineering techniques, using tools, what we did is that we tried to understand what would be the level of inundation if there is a flood. And if you are from an engineering background, you would understand that there are different return periods associated depending upon the magnitude of flood that we are considering. So this is the level of inundation if there is a 10 years return period flood. This is for 50 years return period. Just see how the level of inundation and the area which is being affected changes with every increasing years of return period. This is for 100 years return period, and this is for almost 1000 years return period. Now this is as same as what we have in case of India when we were just seeing the hazard atlas, the earthquake zonation map for India, right? So this is nothing different. That was for earthquake, and this is for flood. Now the question is, how do you use this information? How do you ensure that this information or this useful knowledge is actually implemented so that we can prevent disasters? So what these people did is that they used those kind of maps and combined it with the population data of how people are settling down in those areas, and then they went about saying that these are the areas where buildings are to be built. These are the areas where no buildings are to be built. If your building is in this part, then you have to ensure that these are the things that you need to do for your building. It can be structural mitigation, and if you need funds for that, then some amount of fund would be given by the local municipality. So this is how the process flowed. We used data, we used technology, we came up with evidences. We used those evidences to make very factual decisions that needs to be followed, and then the municipality ensured that these are being followed. And the process was, of course, not easy. Getting on board to these kind of projects is not at all easy. You need stakeholder consultations. You need all the stakeholders to come aboard, agree with us and say, yeah, yes, we will do this. So it's not an easy process, but this was done. Similar kind of maps in case of flood is also available in India. As Professor Prakash said, we have maps for the entire of India. We have maps for a particular state. So this can be done. And we have good colleges, we have good universities, IITs, we have colleges like LDCE even, they have the potential to create these kind of maps, right? So it's not that the resources or the information that France or any other nation, US or Japan may have, we do not have it, we do have it. The question is that how do we use that knowledge? How do we implement that knowledge? That is where we probably lack. And because we lack, this is what happens each and every year during after monsoon. This is what we see, and this is probably all of you probably have seen. So this you have seen, probably some of you have also seen this. And probably some of you have also seen these kind of images which was circulated on WhatsApp or even on verified Twitter handles. So it's not that we do not have the information or we do not have the knowledge that we cannot use it. It's not that. We do have it, but there is a huge black hole that exists, and that is what ensures our failure to prevent disasters. Now, why I was stressing on understanding the process of disasters is that when during monsoon, when there is heavy precipitation and which eventually leads to urban floods, we blame the urban floods. We blame climate change to an extent, that this is because of climate change that the precipitation pattern has changed, the intensity of rainfall has increased, and therefore there is huge floods coming in. But we tend to ignore the process of the entire thing. We tend to ignore the vulnerabilities that we have been building in. In the first go, we should have actually imagined that during monsoons there is a chance that every year the precipitation level would probably change or it would become erratic. So our planning of building a road should take in account those kind of things, but we did not, right? So this is the basic understanding behind interpreting disaster not as an event or as the urban flood or as an earthquake, but the importance lies in understanding disaster as a process, so that we understand that disaster ऐसे ही नहीं होता है. There are hazardous events like floods, like earthquakes, and it needs to interact with the vulnerabilities of assets, and it is those things that actually is determining the consequence, which might be a disaster, right? So this is important. So what I have tried to explain till now is that disasters are not events, they are processes. What I have tried to explain is that disasters are not events, they are consequences, right? Consequences of the entire process. But prima facie, we are always the one who blame the earthquake or the cyclone or the urban floods as disasters. And the third point that I have been using frequently in the last 2-3 slides is that disasters can be prevented. Disasters can be prevented. The important point to note here is that certain hazards, right, like earthquake or cyclone, they cannot be prevented. But essentially, those earthquakes or those cyclones need not become a disaster. So that process of that event becoming a disaster, we can prevent that. And that is where we should all actually start thinking about. So this is another important statement that I want all of you to kindly note and kind of imbibe. We saw the process, right, of how an event becomes a disaster. Now, an earthquake or a cyclone or a tsunami is a very natural process. It's a natural phenomena. But essentially, those hazards need to interact with the vulnerabilities of the assets. And it has to be at a point where the capacity is not enough to manage the emergency or the crisis situation, right? So it is not basically the natural processes or the natural phenomena which is responsible for the disaster, right? It is the vulnerabilities of the exposed assets which is actually responsible for the event becoming a disaster. So all over these years for the last, I don't know, from the times that we have actually come across a chapter on disaster management in any of our textbooks, what clearly is being said is that disasters are of two types: natural and man-made disasters. But we need to understand that disasters are not those events, are not basically those hazards. It's not that. Not at all. It's completely different, right? It is a process, and this process is in a way determined and it is contributed by our decisions, our knowledge, our inactions, our ignorance, and so the consequence or the disaster is not is not natural in any way. So the hazards can be natural, hazards can be human induced, but disasters are not natural. This is a very important understanding that you should take home after this session. If you want to challenge me with an example, I would welcome your comment on that. But that is up to our discussion and we'll discuss it. But this is very important for us to understand that disasters are really not natural. Hazards can be natural, it can be human induced, but the consequence, the process leading to that consequence is due to our decisions, our inactions, our ignorance. And so disasters can no way be said to be natural. An important understanding is that when you say that disasters are natural, what happens is that you tend to ignore or omit the relevance of exposure and vulnerability. And you come to the point where you say that यार ये तो भूकंप था, ये तो इतना बड़ा सा साइक्लोन था, इसमें हम क्या कर सकते हैं? This is God made and this is huge, we cannot do anything. So this is basically we are trying to get rid of the blame. We are not taking responsibility of it. We need to understand that we have advanced to a stage where we have the information, the knowledge, the capacities to kind of deal with all these things. But when we say कि यार ये तो भगवान का देन है और कुछ कर नहीं सकते, then you can't help it. So this is a very important motivator which is important in the realm, in the field of disaster risk management, that it's not the hazard that is leading to the disasters. There are many other factors that leads to a disaster. Yet, although we have these kind of understandings in the field, although we have that, what happens is that these kind of litigations are very common. If some of you can read Hindi, you would probably know that Indra Devta is being blamed for whatever is happening. So this is a very important understanding that one needs to develop, that the event leads to a disaster and our cumulative decisions or inactions leads to the disaster, right? So this is very important. So the point that we need to note till now is that hazards are not disasters. Cyclones and earthquakes and tsunamis, they are not disasters, they are just hazards. They have the probability to cause loss. They might not have the probability to cause loss. What ensures that there is a loss due to a hazard is the vulnerabilities of the exposed assets. Disasters are not events. There is a whole lot of process that goes behind which helps in converting the event, the hazardous event, into a disaster. Disasters are not natural. If you look at disasters being the procedural consequence of something, then you will always have to accept the fact that disasters are not natural. And then a last important point, disasters are slow onset. We often refer to rapid onset disasters and rapid onset disasters like earthquake. But if you look up the Haiti earthquake of 2010, you would see that whatever led to the deaths of people, to the damages of the building, is not because of the earthquake that happened on that particular day. It is because of what has been happening for hundreds and 500 years. So the consequence that happened is because of a process that has been taking place for a long time. So the process is a slow onset one, which we also discussed, that exposure, vulnerabilities, and capacities are either developed or are not developed over a huge, long period of time. So the understanding of disasters being rapid onset disasters and slow onset disasters is actually incorrect. Disasters are also slow onset. Now, hazards can be rapid onset, can be slow onset. There's no problem with that. But disasters are slow onset ones. So with this, what comes to our mind is that This is what we see. This is our understanding of disaster management. If you ask anyone crossing the road that what do you understand by disaster management, this is the picture that one gets on his or her mind. The devastation, the destruction, the damaged buildings and all this. But my question is that if we have understood or if we accept the idea that disasters are not natural, it's because of procedures going behind it, then how do we prevent this? The problem is this, that we are on the left circle, right? We have this idea that disaster management is all about response. It is all about managing the consequence. But if you look at how the hazard profiles are changing, some because of climate change, some not because of climate change, we essentially need to move to the right circle, where we start living with risk. And when you start living with risk, or you even try to imagine living with uncertainties, the first thing that you need to do is to understand what risk is, because we are not ready to manage the consequences. It's not the right approach. Each and every time we cannot wait for a hazardous event to lead to a disaster and then we go on the field and try to respond to it. That is not going to work out. And imagine this also. So if an earthquake affects a particular town, let's say in 1980s, the total amount of asset would have been worth, let's say, of 1 crore, right? So that was the earthquake that happened in 1980s. Over a period of time, development happened, and the total accumulated asset of that region now, on this day, probably has become 100 crores. So now, if the same earthquake or an earthquake bigger than that actually hits this city, what is at stake? It's not 10 crore which is stake. It is now 100 crores which is at stake. So the idea of responding to that consequence of 100 crores loss is essentially foolish to do, right? So what we need to do is that we need to start living with risk, living with these uncertainties that things will change in the future. Can be because of climate change, cannot be because of climate change, can be because of what we are doing, what inactions have led to it. But essentially what we need to do is that we need to understand risk. So what is risk? We will not go into the technicalities of what risk is, but we will try to understand risk as a layman does. Risk of something, right? That is what we say. Risk of life loss, risk of economic loss, risk of widespread illness. So risk of a disaster is basically all of this put together. Risk of life loss, risk of damage, risk of economic loss. Now, risk of disaster is not disaster itself. Risk of a disaster is that an event would eventually become a disaster and what is the probability associated with it, right? So when we are talking about disaster risk or a risk of disaster, we are basically talking about the probability that a particular event would lead to this much amount of life loss, this much amount of damage, and this much amount of economic loss. So it is just that. What happens is that people generally use it very interchangeably. Disaster management, disaster risk management, disaster risk and disaster. It's not the same. Disaster is again the consequence. But disaster risk is developing an understanding that some event can happen which can lead to a disaster. What is the probability? What are the chances behind it? Right? So if we need to understand disaster risk, we can use what we have already understood when we were talking about the process of an event becoming a disaster. Hazard, exposure, vulnerability, and capacity. So let's bring in the concept of chance or probability in it. What are the chances that I or my city or my house will be affected by an earthquake? What are the chances? If that particular earthquake happens, how much of my assets would be exposed to it? Right? If those that much amount of asset is exposed to that earthquake, what are my vulnerabilities? And do we have the capacities? So these are all questions of chance and probability. And once we try to understand all of this, we are on our way to understand disaster risk, right? So if we break it further, what happens, or break it further, rather we see it from the lens of how we saw disaster as a process, this becomes very easy for us to understand. So there is a hazard, there is a level of probability, there is a level of chance which is involved in it, that is affecting the elements at risk, which we say exposure, that is interacting with the vulnerabilities of the exposed assets, and that is generating a risk. Now, when this risk manifests or the risk is realized, it becomes an event of emergency where we are needed to respond or we are required to react if we are not prepared enough. And if that is beyond the capacity, that becomes a disaster. So you see, disaster risk is completely different from what disaster is. While the idea of risk is emergent and futuristic, the concept of disaster is consequential. So when you are here, disaster, everything has happened. The risk has been realized, the risk has materialized, the risk has manifested itself. We need to understand risk at this particular point where we can have a provision of somehow reducing those risks. So that is what it is. So this is how everything is balanced. The concept of risk is driven by hazards, the chances of occurrence, exposure, how much of asset is exposed, how much vulnerable those assets are. And then when it is realized, how much of capacity do we have to respond to it, to react to it, and in some cases even recover, rebuild, or reconstruct. So this is how risk can actually be conceptualized. I am not saying that if you know this, you become an expert of understanding risk. No, it's not possible at all. But these are the nuances where you start understanding what risk is all about. Now, these are the definitions, and I do not want you to go into the definitions. It's mugging up, and I do not like mugging up, so we will not do that. But what we will do is that we'll try to understand this with, again, an example to which we will probably relate to. So let's talk about COVID-19, because COVID-19 is something that we all have faced. We all have experienced, right? So in case of COVID-19, what is the hazard? COVID-19, again, is the consequence. It is the infection or the disease, whatever you want to term it as, it is that. But what is causing that? It is the virus, right? And the way the virus is spreading. So the hazard in this case is the SARS coronavirus 2. That's the first important thing. And because the virus spreads from one person to the other, it's zoonotic virus, similar to the one which is currently in news, monkeypox. But any which way, so it's the virus, yes, of course, and the way it is spreading from one person to the other. So if I am infected by SARS coronavirus 2, I am basically a walking hazard, because if I am not following COVID appropriate behavior, probably I will spread it to my colleague or my family members, right? So the hazard primarily, again, is SARS coronavirus 2, but because it moves from one person to the other due to the way it's spreading, even a person, an infected person, can be said to be a walking hazard in that case. So that's the hazard. Now exposure, we have seen what has happened. So the entire world went into a lockdown. India, the country, went into a lockdown. So how did it spread and what all was exposed? The entire world was exposed because initially because of how connected our lives were. Imagine this: if the virus was not found in China, in Hubei province, which is very well connected, and it was found in some remote area of Africa, do you think the effects and impacts would have been the same? Probably not. According to my understanding, you could have a different opinion, but because of how connected our lives are, because how connected everything is in a way, the entire world was exposed. Not only people, but also economy to a huge extent, right? That's the first thing. The second thing is that how we lead our lives. The younger population in our country, in our state, they tend to have a life which is mostly outside our home. It's not indoor-based. So people go out to work, people go out to party, and many different things happen. So that is also a way how our communities got infected and how they were exposed. And then again, the important factor of how appropriately we were following the behaviors that we were supposed to. We have come across many examples, many experiences of why the virus was spreading, because some of us were not willing to follow the rules and regulations. So this is the exposure, the entire world, certain communities, and why? Because of the behavior, because of the mannerisms, so all these things. But the important thing is that everything which was exposed was not affected and not impacted in the same way, not at all, very differently. So what defined or what basically kind of dictated how much of effect and impact someone or some asset was going to experience, that was determined by the vulnerability, right? So there are certain examples that I have cited here, which ranges from individual vulnerability to vulnerability at the scale of a state or at the state of at the level of a nation. For example, if you come across this photo, which is at the left corner of the presentation, so you see the virus which is affecting a person who already has high morbidities, right? High comorbidities, for example, problems with heart, problems with lung, they would be affected more. However, it's good that I was not having a severe symptoms of COVID-19, but it affected me less. But if the same virus would have affected someone with higher comorbidities, he would have been impacted much more, right? So it was the individual vulnerability which kind of dictated how much of effect, how much of an impact that virus would have. Now come to the next picture where we see the problem of hunger and all that. So yes, at the level of the state or at the level of the nation, we were forced ourselves to be locked down, and we barely managed to deal with the unemployment due to that, specifically to those particular group of people who were and still are unwaged laborers, daily laborers, those kind of people, right? And if you come to the next one, it is basically reflecting the condition of our healthcare systems, of our healthcare infrastructures. The first wave was probably something which happened very suddenly, so we were not well prepared, but we did have a substantial amount of time to prepare ourselves for the second wave, which we did not, and we all know how it panned out. So it's not essentially that if you're exposed that you would experience that kind of effects and impact. It also depends upon the kind of vulnerabilities, the level of vulnerabilities that you have, and that can range from individual vulnerabilities to vulnerabilities at the state level, at the national level also. And then there were capacities. So everything was not bad that was happening. We had some capacities to deal with it. We had risk governance strategies like Arogya Setu, which led to defining of containment zones. We had researches that were going on, which we were successful in preparing vaccines. So there were good things also. So in a way, we also had certain capacities. Of course, the capacities were not enough to manage the emergency or the crisis that we were going through, and hence, of course, it's a disaster. But we did have those kind of capacities too. So now you see, what happens is that this idea of disaster risk dependent upon these four variables, or the ideation of disaster as a process depending upon this four variables, is way clearer to us. I hope it is way clearer to us. So the understanding of disaster risk management, if you have noted, my first slide, the title slide, had disaster management with risk in between. So the entire idea of disaster risk management as the field has evolved over a period of time is that bilkul risks nahi lene ka, right? And how do you do it? Only if you are aware of the risks, if you are capable enough or empowered enough to understand those risks. So it is based on this that we come to this particular conclusion, that disaster management as such, the field, the science, has gone a lot of evolution. We still refer to this field as disaster management, yes, of course, but essentially that there is this wave where we have started embracing this field as disaster risk management and not disaster management. Why? Because the inherent understanding of the word disaster management is that we are managing the consequence, right? So we are not, it's a very foolish thing to do. We are not doing that. So what we are doing is that we are trying to manage disaster risk, which involves of two important things: disaster risk reduction, which is reduction of existing risk, and the second important thing is prevention of creation of new risk. So whatever risk exists, understand that and try to reduce it, and make sure that no new risks are created in the process of development. And all said and done, whatever you do, there would be cases where probably, you know, things would go out of hand. You would not have the capacities to kind of manage the consequence, the crisis or the emergency. So that is where you manage the disaster. You bring in your response, you do relief, you have to obviously undergo recovery, which will include reconstruction and rehabilitation. But the entire gamut of things within DRR, that is disaster risk reduction and managing disaster, is together termed as disaster risk management. And I'm very sure that you would come across very few people who would actually tell you that this is how it is. This is how the field has evolved. This is how we actually try to understand our entire field, our entire discourse actually, right? So the question is that managing disasters becomes equivalent to disaster management, and this is what people think is disaster management is all about. Something happens and we are responding to it. But it's not limited to that. It is there, an important part, but there are a lot of things that surpasses it. So when we are talking about disaster risk reduction, what essentially I need you to understand is that what is your role if you are a student, if you are a professional, if you are a professor, if you are an academician, if you are a researcher, if you are a practitioner, what is your role in disaster risk reduction? And the most important one actually is that are your inactions leading to risk creation, right? So try to, you know, kind of adapt to the idea that disaster management is not merely managing disasters. It is disaster risk management, which involves disaster risk reduction as well as managing disasters. So how do you manage disaster risk? If you ask someone, they would probably say that this is the disaster cycle, disaster management cycle, and this is how it is done, right? So you start by understanding your disaster risk, and then you do some prevention, mitigation, preparedness, and then when something happens, you will respond to it, and then if it goes beyond your control, then you start planning for recovery, which includes reconstruction and rehabilitation, right? So this is the entire idea of how someone would try to explain what disaster risk management is. But there is a problem. The problem is that I will not give you the solution per se, but I will leave you with an idea that if we consider disaster risk management as a cycle, I think it's not a good thing to do again. So here it is.
You've seen me in the news. I cost you hundreds of billions of dollars each year. I destroy lives. Sometimes forever. By now, you probably met me in person. Do I have your attention? So far, you have defended yourself, responded, tried to rebuild what I destroyed. You recovered, and eventually, you forgot. Disaster. Respond. Recover. Repeat. Disaster.
Disaster.
Respond.
Respond.
Recover.
Recover.
Repeat.
Repeat. We have to break this vicious cycle. Recover better. Reduce risk. Build resilience. Focus on prevention. Prevention saves lives.
So what I try to do with this video is to give you an idea that our understanding of disaster risk management or disaster management per se as a cycle is flawed somewhere, because we seem to be somehow engulfed in this vicious cycle of responding, recovering, and then again experiencing a disaster, and then we are just doing rounds and rounds and rounds, and we are really not moving out of the cycle and looking forward, right? So whether you want to still accept the ideology of disaster management cycle or disaster cycle is completely up to you, but I just wanted to give you a thought that perhaps it is flawed to a particular extent. So now I have given you a lot of items to think over, which might be challenging to your existing belief systems. And some of you might already know this, so I warned all of you before the presentation that it might be repetitive to some people. But then we need to understand that to have come to this understanding that the disaster management cycle needs to be looked at again, it's flawed to a certain extent, that disasters are not natural, disasters are basically processes leading to certain consequences. This has not happened in a day, in a month, or in 10 years, right? What has happened essentially is that the entire world or the community of disaster risk management professionals, disaster researchers, they have gone through this effect of Dunning-Kruger. I don't know how many of you know this, but it's basically that when you know nothing, you tend to, kind of start building on that, and you achieve a level when you feel that, yes, I have considerable amount of knowledge and a lot of confidence, but actually you know nothing because you don't have that competence. And then you again go down to a valley of despair, and then you start learning, and then you kind of start coming up with confidence, and then also you become competent, right? So the entire field, all the professionals, the researchers, academicians, practitioners, they have all gone through this. In fact, we are still going through this. And this is very important for us to understand. I will start with an example of how old this field is. You probably would know, some of you would know, some of you would not know, but I will just cite a very common, not common, but a very interesting case actually. So what you see in front of you is from an age when there was no photography possible, right? And this is an actual incident that happened. It was in 1755, and this happened in Lisbon, where an earthquake happened, that too in Atlantic Ocean, which is seismically very quiet, comparatively, of course. An earthquake happened. An earthquake happened due to which, of course, buildings were damaged and churches fell down. Due to this earthquake, because of the event All Saints' Day that was going on and was being celebrated in that particular city, there were feasts being made. So there were celebrations. So in terms of candles and food being prepared in kitchen. So the earthquake led to fire. And simultaneously, what happened is that the earthquake also led to a tsunami. So this was a very interesting flow of events that happened back in 1755. So an earthquake leading to a tsunami, and then the earthquake also caused the fire. And the tsunami was 6 meters high. So imagine it's almost like one floor, if you consider a normal Indian building that way. So this is what happened back in 1755. What is interesting about this event is that some of you would know this, that there were two philosophers and thinkers, Voltaire and Rousseau. So Rousseau writes to Voltaire in 1756, responding to something that Voltaire asked him about the 1755 earthquake. And he said that, very clearly it is said, that nature did not construct 20,000 houses of 6 to 7 stories. So nature did not construct the houses which fell down, which were 6 to 7 stories. And if the inhabitants of this great city were more equally spread out, that is referring to the planning of the city, and more lightly lost, that is the usage pattern of the building, damages would have been much less and perhaps to no account. Now, can we use our own understanding that we have developed till now to explain this event? Yes. So what were the hazards? Earthquake, tsunami, and fire. What was exposed? The entire city of Lisbon, the buildings, the churches, and the people, of course, their economy, the livelihood, everything was exposed. What were the vulnerabilities? Russo points out very clearly the design of the building, the typology of the building, the planning of the city. And of course, the people were not prepared. So that is what led to the incident, the event, the disaster, right? So this is back in 1755. Over a period of time, internationally, globally, many things happened. And primarily, if we are to kind of put a pin on something from where it all started, we would probably go back to the 1960s and 1970s, when the United Nations started thinking of disasters that, from the perspective that they are loss bringers, loss harbingers. They create destruction, damage, and they lead to losses. So in 1970 to 1990, the entire idea was about relief. So this UNDRO was created, that is United Nations Disaster Relief Office. Over a period of time, the United Nations General Assembly thought that let's declare a decade of natural disaster reduction, 1990 to 99, where we'll probably come together and think what all could be done, right? So that's from 1990 to 1999. And within this period of time, a conference happened that is referred to as the First World Conference on Natural Disaster. It happened in 94. Yokohama strategy was the outcome, and countries who agreed to this were supposed to do something. So we are not going into the details because it's important but not so relevant in today's session. So that was the first conference that happened. Moving on, 10 years later, in 2005, the Second World Conference on Disaster Reduction. Now, what I want all of you to note is that how, over a period of time, the titles of the conference also changed. So the First World Conference was on natural disasters, right? The second one was on disaster reduction, natural gone. So see how the field is evolving and refer it to the Dunning-Kruger effect. And the third one, which happened very recently, that is in 2015, it's about disaster risk reduction, not even about disaster reduction. So natural gone, disaster reduction gone. What we are actually trying to do is disaster risk reduction, right? And it has basically laid down very simple things, which I am sure Professor Surya Prakash have already explained to you to a certain extent. So I will not go into that. But what I will try to emphasize upon is that this idea, the chart that you see in front of you, is that it works in a very interesting manner. So what the framework says is that you focus all of your activities on the 4 priorities and do it over a period of, let's say, 15 years. So the Sendai framework is valid from 2015 to 2030. So do all of these activities in these 4 priority areas for 15 years, and you would be able to achieve the 7 targets that will lead to the achievement of the goal. And finally, at the end of 2030, you would be able to come to that particular defined outcome. So most of the work, right, a huge amount of work needs to be done in these priority areas. If you are able to understand your risk, then you will be able to prevent or mitigate or prepare for it. And that would require, to a certain extent, risk governance. That would require some amount of investment. So that is how the priority, the first priority, the second priority, and the third priority talks about. And it recognizes that although you can prepare for a maximum of something, it can always go beyond it. So that is where you have to be prepared for effective response also. So that is where the 4th priority comes in, right? So if you see the scheme of things, even the part which actually talks about managing disasters or responding to disasters is the 4th priority. The first priority is understanding risk. The second is about strengthening risk governance in terms of utilizing those risk information for development purposes, investing in it, and then if the emergency situation goes beyond your capacity or goes out of hand, you will have to respond to it. And when you're doing this, you are actually trying to achieve the targets. Because if you are understanding risk and then you are doing something about prevention, mitigation, and you are investing it, of course, what you are doing it for? You are doing to reduce the mortality, that is the number of deaths. You are doing it because you want to decrease the number of affected people. So the work is on the 4 priorities, and all of these things will eventually fall into place. And the interesting thing, the most interesting rather, is that all of us, coming from different walks of life, different sectors, different academic spheres, we all are contributing in one of these priorities, or in some cases more than one. When you talk about a structural engineer or a civil engineer, his research or his work about understanding, let's say, the vulnerability, the structural vulnerability of a building is understanding disaster risk. That is understanding seismic risk, right? Using that information, making sure that rules and regulations are drafted, that is risk governance. Understanding risk might also lead to an option where you would be required to retrofit the building. So that would require investment, right? So once you have combined all of this, and even if there is an earthquake which is beyond the, in technical terms, we call it building design, basic design earthquakes and the maximum credible earthquake. So if it goes beyond it, if there's an earthquake that is beyond that particular thing, you should be capable enough to manage it, right? So this is how the 4 priorities play out, and all of us, coming from a civil engineering background or a computer science background or a public health expert, everyone is contributing. It's just that we do not see it coherently, that we are all contributing towards one of these priorities or more than that, but we are actually doing that. And the most important thing is that DRM is basically everyone's business. That is what the Sendai framework very clearly states, that it's not just the government who has a role to play. It's not the communities who are affected. Disaster risk management is their business. No, it's every one of us. I think Professor Surya Prakash also laid a lot of stress on that we all have to come together and contribute towards it, depending on the role or the responsibility that we have officially. So that's one thing. And the next question that should come to your mind is that, why are we doing this? What is the need? We are doing very good with managing disasters. We have battalions of NDRF, we have state battalions of SDRF, we are doing good disaster management per se, disaster risk reduction to a certain extent we are doing them. Why are we doing this? What is the entire objective? To my understanding is that we are doing this to attain a state of resilience, right? When I say a state of resilience, I essentially mean this, that whenever there is a hazard, which can be a rapid onset one or a slow onset one, that is in terms of a shock or in terms of a stress, it can manifest. That can vary from the level of an individual to a community to a state or a nation, must have the capacity to first resist it, the shock or the stress. If we are not able to resist it, then we must have the capacity to absorb it and then accommodate the changes which the stress or the shock brings. Then we will have to adapt to it and also transform to a certain extent and then recover, and all of this in a very timely fashion. The important point is that this is the written definition of resilience. But the understanding and interpretation of resilience varies from one person to other, from one community to other. And what has actually happened is that we use the term resilience very, very loosely. It has become that it is like a hot cake. And we keep on using resilience in phrases and sentences where it makes no sense at all. You see, you cannot build resilience in a day. Again, it's not very easy, because if you are talking about, let's say, at the community level or at the state or the national level, to be able to resist a shock or a stress requires a lot of contemplation, a lot of planning, a lot of preparedness. It cannot be done in a day, right? And if you have a system in place which kind of absorbs the shock and tries to modify and transform the community in a way and recover from it, it also requires a lot of resources in it. So this cannot be done in a day. But I have come across phrases and texts where we talk about rapid resilience, and it's not accurate. It's not accurate. We talk about and we sometimes tag certain areas and villages as resilient. This means essentially that that particular village, we are saying that they are in a state where they are capable of withstanding or resisting and then also recovering from a hazard or from an event, from a disaster per se. And they are capable enough, they have been empowered. What this also means is that since we are tagging them as resilient, they are good to go by themselves. They have the ability to manage their affairs by themselves, so they do not need any external aid or support. Now, this might appear to be a good context, but this might not be acceptable to the communities whom we are tagging as resilient. You may have come across many researches or papers where we tag communities from Assam as resilient. Why? Because they have the capabilities to kind of experience, witness, and also recover from floods every year. But this also, from the other end, also very clearly points out that since you are resilient, you would not need our support to a large extent, right? Because you are dealing with it, you are habitual. So what I'm trying to say is that the understanding of resilience varies from person to person, from one community to other community, and we care very less about how it is being understood or interpreted or being used. And what has happened is that we have started using it very casually, which makes no sense at all. So resilience is basically a very, very big word with huge connotations behind it, huge. And we should actually try to understand what it means. If you even start digging how the word resilience has come into the field of disaster risk management, you would be amazed to know that this is basically a word that has been derived from Latin, and it has been used in many different contexts. At one time, the Latin variant of this word was used to denote divorce, as in marriage, and now that is now being used in a very positive way. And how this word has actually crossed different oceans and has been accepted in the entire world. So that's a very different story altogether, and a lot of work, a lot of understanding has gone behind it, which we tend to ignore when we start using the word resilience. So the underlying fact is that disaster risk management, all of what we are doing, be it disaster risk reduction or managing disasters, it is that we are doing it to achieve a state of resilience. Whether we are resilient or not, that is very difficult to determine. You will come across different indices, you will come across different ways of determining it, but then again, how do you understand resilience? Is resilience, this resilience that you are talking about, is it against a particular hazard or multiple hazards? Who is this resilient? Who are you talking about? Are you talking about the community? Are you talking about an individual? Are you talking about the state? Who are you talking about? And who is going to work to ensure that resilience is built? Because on one hand, you want the community to be resilient, so you also want them to come into the process of building resilience. And then when you are saying resilient, you in a way you are keeping your hands off, saying that you are already resilient, so we do not need to, the external aids and supports do not need to go to you, right? So there is a huge discourse behind how the word resilience is used, but largely if you stick to the bookish definition, this is what resilience looks like. At any level, you have to do all these things, you should have the characteristics to do all these things, but of course in a well-defined timeline. So resilience is at the core, and all of these things, all of these global and national agendas are working together in coherence, and I'm sure Professor Gupta has talked about all this. So there's this Sendai framework, there's this Sustainable Development Goal, there's this COP21. In fact, COP21 is the treaty, that's why it's recurrently used, but what we are the stage we are at now, it's COP27, which is scheduled to be held in Egypt this year. And then there are nationally determined contribution based on the COP21 agreement, how much of greenhouse gases we are supposed to emit, how much we are supposed to cut down. So all of these things together are actually coherently working towards risk-informed sustainable development or resilience per se, right? So if you look at things in different segments or in compartments, it will not give you the flavor, or it will not give you the essence of understanding how it actually works together. So this is what it looks like. This is how everything comes together, and the whole agenda is about building resilience, about risk-informed sustainable development. So just one last part that I would want to cover. This was a video which I would skip, and I would just cover a little bit of interesting things that I think would be essential to kind of build the context of the entire training program. Is that people generally, what happens is that people think that disaster management is a very segmented and not so organized area to work in. As far as research or studies or science is concerned, it is very well organized, and it is a constantly evolving one. Each of the researchers at one stage, challenges themselves that, you are wrong. So this is something that we need to come up with. So that also happens. But the part where we are actually working on the ground in terms of implementation or action, that is where one perhaps might have a feeling that it's very disorganized, it's not structured. And yes, of course, I would have agreed to that around, let's say, before 1990s, I guess. But then, as I said, as per the Dunning-Kruger effect, we are all learning, and we generally tend to compare our country with other countries and say, no, we are not doing better. It's not that. We are evolving, we are learning, and we understand that we cannot emerge as a pioneer rapidly. We cannot be that. It is a process, and we are going through it. So the understanding is that let's not compare with other countries what they are doing in disaster management. We have a process of our own. We are following it, and we are perfecting ourselves over a period of time. And in the process, what has happened is that to ensure that disaster risk management, the essence of it, is actually getting implemented, you need a structure, right? So how that structure is manifested in real world, that is where I am coming to. I look at it as a game of chess. So the larger objective probably is risk-informed sustainable development or resilience. And within our scope of disaster risk management, we try to see it in 3 different instruments. We need to have the larger objective of risk-informed sustainable development or resilience. So a strategy to achieve that. What we need is a tool which will give us power to work towards that particular goal that we have decided. And with the tool, we should also have a plan as to how to kind of implement that. So this is how disaster management also functions. We have a policy, disaster management policy, which kind of lays down the entire strategy with an intended outcome. We have the act, which gives us a lot of power as to how to achieve that. And there is the plan. So now you have the strategy, you have the power, now you have to plan as to what to do. So this is exactly how the system works. It's not disorganized, it's very well organized and very well structured. And I will just walk you through certain examples to make sure that, yes, these things are there and they are functional. So this is the DM policy of 2009. I am skipping this because not that very important, in the sense that it basically gives you an outline of what we intend to achieve, right? We have the Disaster Management Act of 2005. And since disaster management is a subject from the concurrent list of the Constitution of India, both the national government and the state government can make laws on it. So it's not only the national act, there can be a state act also, and of course Gujarat has its own act of 2003. So what the act does, as I said, is that it gives you power. How does it give you power? With an institutional setup, with legal power, with financial powers, and with setting up the stage for coordination mechanisms at the national level, state level, district, and the local levels. And then we have the plan. We had the policy, we had the act, which gives you the power basically and the plan. So this is the national plan that we are seeing in front of our screen. Every state, every district, every department is supposed to have such a plan. It's in the act, right? So the first national disaster management plan was out in 2016, and it was the first plan that adhered to the Sendai framework. Then a revised version came out in 2019, and this plan is actually giving you, those bits and pieces of how to achieve the larger objective. So when I'm saying that, when I'm claiming actually rather that these are structured machineries and they are functioning well, the question that you should ask me is that, was it used in COVID-19? If I'm saying that it's well structured and organized and all that, was it used in COVID-19? Yes, it was used in COVID-19. So the plan lays down that if the hazard or the disaster that we are dealing with is of a particular nature, then a particular ministry of the government is supposed to deal with it. If it's a biological and public health emergency, BPHE, then the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare is supposed to deal with it. So this is exactly what happened. This was a notification which came out on 11th March 2020, saying that the power was being delegated to MOHFW. And this happened according to what the plan says, and the power that is used comes from the Disaster Management Act of 2005, right? And again, if you see another notification, this was in March, 14th March, it notifies COVID-19 as a disaster. So why it is important, that's a complete different discussion. We will have it sometime else. But this was done, and this was done in accordance to the provision of the plan as well as the act. To end everything, what I would like to emphasize upon is this, that whenever there is a disaster, what happens is that you come across a news where the politicians or big leaders come up and say or request the government to declare that particular disaster as a national disaster. Now, there is no provision, executive or legal, to declare a natural calamity as a national calamity, right? So you might have come across many such claims to declare a particular disaster as a national disaster, but that is not supposed to happen. That cannot happen, right? So this is where I close my presentation with these very important points. I hope I have not bored you, but these are the final takeaways that I think would be important for you to either agree to me or disagree to me. But of course, you need to think upon all these things. That first of all, hazards are not disasters. So our idea of saying that an earthquake is a disaster, a cyclone is a disaster, is flawed, and this needs to change, and this should start from us. So hazards are not disasters. Disasters are not merely events, but they are processes. And since they're processes, we have a lot to contribute in terms of how unplanned our exposure is, how our vulnerabilities are building in. That's why disasters are not natural. Disasters have legal connotations and implications, as I correctly mentioned in the beginning, that we use the word disaster is very casually, even resilience for that matter. But they have understanding which varies. But disasters have a legal connotation, a legal implication. There is an act to it, right? So it's not a term to be used very loosely, right? And DRM is everyone's business. When we are talking about disaster risk reduction, we were talking about the Sendai framework and understanding risk. I very clearly pointed out that all of us, coming from any different walk of life, any different sphere of research, we are essentially contributing to the whole scheme of things. It is just that we do not know that we are contributing to disaster risk reduction, but we are doing it. The problem is that how we get it implemented on the ground, how the entire thing is facilitated, that is something else. And that's probably where we need to work again and more. But largely DRM is everyone's business, and we are all putting our efforts into it, right? So that was it from my side. Thank you for your attention, and I'm open to questions, of course.
Thank you very much, sir. Thanks a lot. It was a wonderful experience listen to your knowledge. That you explained so nicely that how consequences of process occurred, which we term as disaster, and why the things become vulnerable. And you have given excellent example of city in Paris. So, and specifically, there are many plans, and the plans which is part of mitigations of this risk due to disaster. Is definitely, we learned a lot from you. We enjoyed your lecture. So thank you very much for sparing your valuable time, sir. Thank you very much. So
Thank you.
now the session is open for questions from participants. If you have, you can please raise your hand here.
Hello. Hello.
Yes,
Sir,
yes, ma'am.
I want,
Yes,
ma'am, sir, could you explain what is this Shindai framework, sir? This is what, can we just explain what is Shindai framework?
Sure. So, ma'am, over a period of time, what has happened is that all countries have come together. It started back in '94, and then it again happened in 2005, and then it again happened in 2015. So what happens is that all of the countries come together and they work out a strategy, a policy, or a framework, and whichever country agrees to it, they are supposed to work on achieving the objectives of that framework. So the latest framework in our field of disaster risk management is the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. More than 180 countries have agreed and adopted Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. So all of these countries are working towards achieving the outcome of the Sendai framework. So the Sendai framework also has 7 targets which is required to be achieved in a span of 15 years. These 7 targets are like reducing the loss, reducing deaths substantially by 2030, reducing the number of people who have been affected in disasters by 2030, reducing economic losses. So like this, there are 7 targets which are to be achieved. And all of the countries, after every year, they report this data. And the data is reported to the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, where they are monitored. Now, it is only for the purpose of monitoring that this data is kept. The UN does not have any right to, kind of suggest that you need to do that, you need to do this. That's not the case. But the idea is that every year, every country should gather all the data of all the disasters, how many people have died, how many people have been affected, what the economic losses, and report it. So this entire process is called Sendai Framework Monitoring. And it is a self-assessment in a way. For example, if India is reporting certain amount of losses this year, and if it is reporting a certain amount of losses in the next year, which is higher, it means that we have not been able to do what we should have, right? So it's kind of a self-assessment, a self-understanding. So these are the 7 targets that we have to work towards. So the 7 targets, and where do we work? What do we work? That is defined by the 4 priorities. So the first priority is understanding disaster risk. You can do nothing until and unless you have a very clear understanding of what risk you are dealing with. So the first priority is understanding risk. The second is that once you have understood the risk, you will obviously need to prevent it or mitigate it or prepare for it. And that at a point of time would require governance. For example, if I say that I have understood my risk and that will not help. Now, in case of India, what has essentially happened is that the risk is understood in terms of this particular area is prone to earthquake, this particular area is prone to cyclone, but then what about it? How do you prevent it? So the government has come up with different types of schemes. For example, in case of cyclone, we have the National Cyclone Risk Mitigation Project, which is working in all the coastal states of India. The first phase has been done. The second phase is ongoing. Similarly, there is the National Seismic Risk Mitigation Project, which is coming up. So this is being done from the stature of the government. So that is where risk governance comes in. Now, all of these projects, all of these things that are being done cannot happen for free. So that requires investment. So that is the third priority of Sendai framework. It says that invest in disaster resilience. Now, in case of cyclone and in case of India, so we have understood the risk, we have started a project, we are doing very good, all said and done. we can never be sure that whatever we have prepared for is enough. There can be a cyclone which can actually cause a huge damage. So for that case, we also need to be prepared to respond to it and then recover. So these are the 4 priorities. So the idea is that when you keep working on these 4 priorities, you achieve the 7 target, and finally after 15 years, that is in 2030, you would be in a stage where you can say that yes, I have somehow come closer to the objective or the aim of the Sendai framework. So this is how the Sendai framework works.
So nice of you. Thank you so well. You explained everything. Yeah. Thank you. Very nice.
Sir, another question is there from Vinod Vanwari, sir.
Hello.
You may please ask, sir. Yes.
Yeah. Sir, thank you. Wonderful session. I have been teaching this subject twice. Now, my only humble question is that the disaster is everybody's business. Don't you think that this curriculum may be designed at a school level also, at diploma level also, at education level also, at MTech level also? Though ward officers, they know it. So like in pandemic disaster, Prime Minister briefed the entire nation number of times. Then Finance Minister briefed people number of times. Then RBI Governor briefed number of times. But that all were from economic angles. But what is the immediate action? So what is your suggestion that, see, in diploma we have introduced as an elective subject. That also students take when they are short of a credit. It pains us, but still we teach with the full enthusiasm. So this has to be taken in a curriculum at least after 8th standard. I need your views.
Right. Very valid points made, sir. So again, I will refer back to the Dunning-Kruger effect. We are going through a process of evolution. So earlier, we did not have anything, but now we have something. And it started with the UGC's notification, which very clearly mentioned that this has to be taken into account. So disaster management as a subject has to be taught. The problem is that the UGC notifies and it's up to the individual universities whether they want to take it up or not. Some universities do, some do not. And I cannot question why they do not, because it's very important. So that is one thing that happened, and some good things happened also. Then the AICTE came out with a curriculum at the postgraduate level and also at the undergraduate level. It was a well-defined curriculum. But again, this comes from the AICTs, and again, it somehow, depends upon the university whether we want to do it or not. So that is the second thing. The third thing is that when you talk about, you can always do that, but then the question is, what do you teach and how do you teach it? If you go back and look at NCERT's textbooks, which talks about disaster management, it will be completely contradictory to whatever I have said today. It will not be in line with that. But what I have said today is in line with what the world understands about disaster risk management today. So even if we start talking about disaster risk management and we start teaching disaster risk management, I am afraid that most of us who are not sincere enough will teach them what is not correct. And that is what has happened, sir. But again, the third thing that has happened is that I think Professor Gupta mentioned this also. There is this Indian network of universities which have come together for researches and all this thing. They have also come up with a curriculum on disaster risk reduction. And I would say it's very comprehensive. But all these works are being done, and it is about how we start kind of implementing it. It's up to us. And the most important point which I have felt being in this position at GIDM is that we have never managed, to gather interest of the students. We have always taught disaster management as if it is something very distant. We have not made enough efforts to make them realize that you might think that it is a distant thing, but it is actually who you are creating the entire process.
Correct.
If you are not paying attention to whatever you are being taught in a civil engineering class, for example, how do you construct a bridge, you will go into that profession. You will eventually be one who would be approving or designing a bridge, and your indecision would lead to a disaster. We have never made our students realize that. Never, ever. So somewhere some things are happening. We are also at fault, and this is that time where we all have to come together. I will give you a very fine example, sir. GIDM wanted to start a course on disaster management, postgraduate diploma course. And we were set and we coordinated with GSFC University, and everything was set. The curriculum was set. In fact, we invited researchers and academicians from all over the world to be a part of that course. You would not imagine, sir, not even one candidate registered for the course.
Oh.
So we all are trying, and we understand that we are lacking somewhere, but that is how we are evolving. We have to learn, and then somehow, you know.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, sir. Is there any other query from participants? Please let us know. Okay, sir. So I think you can conclude now. You can conclude. Yes, thank you very much, sir.
Thank you for the opportunity, and I hope my session was helpful. Thank you.
Definitely, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.